Hello, today I want to talk to you about something that is very dear to my heart and I have a tremendous amount of professional experience with. And that if you're in the field of mental health, you definitely need to know about psychological trauma. In this time of the pandemic, when we all are struggling with isolation, with loss, it could be loss of innocence, it could be loss of hope, it could be the loss of somebody that we loved and we weren't able to be with them, a loss of identity. And well before the pandemic, I began to see in my practice, and I've been in practice now 55 years, that all the different types of therapy that I had trained in and been a client in, and I had my own psychological trauma. So I know trauma from my own healing and life experience. I know trauma from working with Mayan groups during the Civil War in Guatemala. I know trauma from having worked in the prison system and worked with young men between the ages of 15 and 25 who had committed murder or deadly assault. And I know about trauma before there was 30 years ago, the information that we have today about how to heal trauma. Even if you were to be able to go to and travel to the United States to learn about trauma, there are only 2 or 3 places in all of the United States, and you'd have to spend 2 or 3 or 4 years in Boston or at Stanford out in California. There are very few trauma training centers even in the United States. And when I started 30 years ago, it was because all of the different types of therapy that I knew I was using to work in training and working with young women who had come to learn about Ericksonian hypnosis, but they came from all of Central America, and all of them had tremendous traumas. Many of them had even fought against their own government. They had been in prison, they had been violated, they had been emotionally and sexually abused, you name it. And I began to notice that even though I was applying everything I knew, the traumatic experiences were not resolving. So I went on a search of many, many, many years to find anyone who was doing something that was effective with trauma. Actually, I was one of the first people to train with Francine Shapiro in EMDR to deal with post-traumatic stress, and for many years I was an international trainer in EMDR. But we know so much more. And what's really important for you to know is that you really don't want to work with trauma if you haven't begun to open to and heal your own traumas on a non-linear, limbic, emotional level. Trauma doesn't heal thought to thought. It doesn't heal explicit to explicit, because each experience and any experience that overwhelms our biological and natural abilities to bounce back with some resilience produces trauma. So you can, and when most people think of trauma, they think of sexual abuse or physical abuse or some horrific accident. That's trauma with a big T. But there can be lots of little tiny traumas, and that's what we're seeing in the pandemic. Little trauma after little trauma after little trauma, and you end up with post-traumatic stress. Now, the first thing I mentioned is you have to be able to be in touch with your own traumatic experiences and begin that process, because when you're working with a client, if their traumatic experience has an echo or reflects the experience you may have that you haven't even started to notice or process, as a therapist, you will stop the person from expressing that trauma. It's automatic. I've seen it cross-culturally. I've seen it with very, very trained therapists who have been in practice for many, many years, inhibiting their client from going where they have never gone themselves. And that's especially true with trauma. The other thing that's so important for you to learn, and I can teach you because I've been there personally, I've been there professionally, I've worked with all sorts of trauma, that it's counterintuitive. Exactly what you would do in responding to a client who isn't reporting a traumatic situation is not what you really should do when you're working with somebody who's highly traumatized. For instance, a traumatized person may be reporting to you. I think of a client who was telling me about horrible physical and sexual abuse as a young adolescent from her stepfather. And tears came to my eyes. That's perfectly all right. But my intuitive sense was just to hug her. Now, I could have said, is it all right if I sit next to you while you talk about this? Or can I give you a hug? But that intuitiveness is inappropriate, because when a person is reporting most traumas, but especially that kind of trauma, they feel they had no power, they were powerless, and that there were no boundaries. There was no way they could stop what was happening. And so if you just spontaneously respond with a hug or even asking, they may intellectually say yes, but the child in them or the traumatized part in them will feel invaded or intruded upon, and you actually increase the traumatic experience. So a lot of the methodology I use and a lot of what I can teach you from a lot of experience is how to sense your intuitive response and how to respond counterintuitively to the client. Also, one of the real difficulties for us as therapists and as coaches and anybody working in a traumatic situation is that we tend to go for the drama. We tend to want to get in there and work. And I can assure you that if you want to heal trauma, yours or your clients, slow always works. You know, over the years, and when I started with trauma, that we were using catharsis, terrible. Never, ever use catharsis as a way of healing trauma. It deepens the trauma and embeds the trauma even more fully in the neurological system of the client. I was using catharsis because that's all we knew at the time. And we want to go with the drama and move the client before you know if the client has the resources. With any client, it's resources, resources, resources before you go into some of the deeper work. But with trauma, if you want to risk perhaps a suicide or the person decompensating, start working with trauma before you see if they have the resources, the clarity to see also, is that client dissociated as a result of the trauma? Because no matter how brilliant your work is, if the person that's traumatized is dissociated, or if they very quickly dysregulate, and you continue working, and I've seen very trained therapists do just that. The client's not there. The client is not receiving what they're paying for, and they will get worse. So not only does slow always work with trauma, but you have to listen a different way, you have to respond in a different way, and you're learning a whole other level of respect for building over time a resilience, because the client has some resilience no matter how severe the trauma was, because they're alive, because they've walked into your office. We often forget when we hear these terribly traumatic experiences, they do have some resources and they do have some resilience, but you don't work with trauma until they have enough resources, until you can see that they're resilient, until they can be grounded, they can get triggered, dysregulate, and regulate, because when you're regulated, you can focus and you can have clarity and you can process. When you're dysregulated, you have no focus, you have no clarity, and there's no way you can process. And trauma is little bit by little bit, little piece by little piece. There's an old joke. How do you eat an elephant? Bite by bite by bite. And when you're working with trauma, and this I can teach you, but you first have to learn through yourself, and I've learned over many years, but you don't have to take the number of years that it's taken me to learn how to be extraordinarily effective with trauma. I can teach you a methodology, a methodology, because it's a mythology that catharsis, or going into the drama, or grounding the person is going to change their traumatic experience. They have to develop those skills themselves, because when you start working with trauma, they're in your office, but 98% of the time they're at work, they're at home, they're in the outside world. They have to have the skills to contain the trauma, even if it's triggered, and it will be triggered on the outside, so that they can begin to find resolution for the trauma and have some balance in their life. And trauma has an implicit, unique meaning for each and every client. So when somebody tells me, yes, and I was 12 years old and my stepfather would come into the room at night and he would lie down in bed and he would abuse me, but I couldn't scream, and I knew that if my mother found out about it, she wouldn't believe me. And believe me, when you're listening to this, you're horrified. But what's really important is she's telling you what she remembers explicitly. And you want to respect that. But you have to be able to begin to tune in to implicitly, what was the meaning of that for her? Let me give you an example. When I was 6 years old or 7 years old, I had an older brother who came to us. He was 12 or 13. He was adopted, and he was a street kid. And as a result of that, he was quite physically abusive with me over periods of time. Now, my parents should have seen the bruises, but they didn't bother to look. But this is common with these type of traumatic experiences. I had a number of therapists over the years work with me on this issue with my older brother. And while it was helpful, it never really resolved, because they had tuned into the explicit, oh, wasn't that terrible for you? Aren't you angry, etc. All of this on an explicit level was true, but the core of the resolution wasn't possible for me because my father was jealous and absent. My mother was totally focused on my older brother and his problems, so I felt abandoned. And my sister had some problems too. She got a lot of attention. But even though there was this level of physical abuse from my brother, he had an affection and a caring for me, a connection and an engagement with me that wasn't coming to me from my mother, and it wasn't coming to me from my father. And so deep down inside, the implicit meaning for me was, yes, he was abusive, but in the environment, he really saved my life because he was the only person that had love for me. My parents may have had love, but they certainly were walled off in their ability to express it. But he could be quite endearing, and he was, in a strange way, protective and caring when he wasn't being abusive. I share this with you because none of the therapists who worked with me, and until one of them really was able to say, well, what did it mean for you? Was I able to even consider, and I guess I was probably a little ashamed that I had this loving connection with him because he was an abuser. When that came into my awareness, now let me point out, with trauma, interpretation simply does not work. When it came into my awareness, and I had and could feel it in my body, and I had the sensations at times of the abuse and at times of the caring and the love, and then I could contemplate what all of this meant and how it fit into a bigger picture, the context of what was happening to me at that time, which wasn't just the abuse, and it was the systemic experience of the entire family, how it functioned and dysfunctioned. Suddenly a healing process could take place. Healing enough that I could talk to you about it, and I'm not getting dysregulated, I'm not horrified. It shouldn't have happened, but we can't go back and change what happens. But in trauma treatment, and I can teach you how to do this, I, with the help of my therapist, supporting me, not telling me what to do, but supporting my finding a different way of experiencing that experience. If I experience it only through the pain, only through the abuse, only through the terror, only through the abandonment, not only can't I change the situation, but I neurologically repeat and repeat and repeat the negative pathways and negative critical voices in myself and all the things that stopped me from feeling whole again. So it's very important that we not try and change the experience, but how I relate to the experience. And that takes a lot of skill to give the kind of support the client needs without telling them how to do it. Because if I tell you how to do it, it's really telling you how I might do it. The expert in the room is the client. And often it's very seductive to move into the explicit traumas and work with them. And the client can be quite dramatic, and you can feel you've achieved a lot, and you've either done very little or deepened the trauma. I'm going to give you another example of a client of mine, and she felt betrayed by her husband and in terrible pain because he started having lunches and dinners with a young woman that worked on his team, and he wasn't mentioning it to her at all. Now, nothing happened between her husband and this young woman, except a series of lunches and dinners, and he gave her a very nice birthday card, etc., etc. But because of her background, feeling that she couldn't be enough, she was totally traumatized, and she indeed really didn't want to continue the marriage, but it was a relatively good marriage, and she wanted to try and repair it. And she realized from her history that she had been very abused and abandoned by both parents over a period of time. Now, everything I'm telling you, you think, oh, there's so much to work with. But I had to learn to listen in a very different way. With trauma, trauma takes place intellectually until the intellectual brain turns off, because at a certain point it's too much, and the intellectual brain is what gives words to it, what symbolizes it. If it doesn't have symbols, it can't process. So trauma actually stays out of your contextual experience of the world, and when it's re-triggered years later, you think that the feelings you're having are the feelings that are occurring because your boss is acting a certain way. Your boss is acting a little bit that way, but it's actually triggered the neurological experience, the biological experience. Trauma affects the bodies, the body, the bones, the muscles, the biochemistry of the person. Every single function of the human being is affected and encoded in each traumatic situation. The one thing that's not encoded is the words that represent it, because the intellect is offline. That's why I said earlier in speaking with you that trauma is nonlinear, it's non-intellectual, and it has to be limbic. It's not explicit because it doesn't have language. That part of your brain has not functioned during the traumatic experience. But in any event, as I listened and struggled with this woman and so on, and she began to tell me what her traumatic experiences were, and then they started to come back together, and he said to her, yeah, but you can't go into my computer all the time. You can't go into everything I do. And she became irate. You've betrayed me. How do I know you're not going to do this again? I want transparency. I want transparency. I want transparency. Now, what I experienced was not that she wanted transparency, because what she was suggesting is that she would be totally intrusive and suspicious of everything he did. And of course, he didn't realize, but he was beginning to react with, how can I go back into a marriage to make it better if everything I do is suspect and I can't prove I've done nothing? If I've done something, that can show up, but how can I prove I didn't do something? Not possible. Now we're at an impasse, and I thought, well, I can work with her traumatic experience and so on, but I just listened to her definition of transparency. And then I asked her about her parents' marriage. Well, her mother never spoke up, but the husband was quite abusive. He was alcoholic. He was a womanizer. He would abandon and come back and abandon and come back, and the mother just accepted it and just lived in a life of pain. Now we're really working with the core of trauma, because this occurred from the time her mother conceived her through most of her life, and certainly in the first few years of life. So I asked her, can you describe to me how your mother internally may have organized her internal world? And at first she was puzzled, and I said, for instance, your mother never speaks up. Do you think the way that she sees her role as a woman is, I don't speak up because that's not the role of a woman. A woman's role is to just suffer with pain and more pain and more pain and more pain. Oh, she said, yeah, I think that my mother's view of the world is just to have pain. And her view of men, I said, now notice she's bringing an internal awareness and she's contemplating. Without those two, forget it. People talk about mindfulness all the time. Mindfulness just calms the system so you can bring yourself to connect to the internal awareness, which means that you can then begin to find words to symbolize traumatic experiences. And once you have the words to symbolize that experience, and then you contemplate what it meant for you, in this case, she was contemplating what's her mother's secret way of, and what does she expect from the world? Men will always cheat, they will always disappoint you, they will always abuse you, and you're only meant to suffer, 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 and never trust, never trust. So hidden in my clients' explicit, I just want, transparency, was this whole belief, organizing belief system of the mother based on her traumatic experiences. Now, why do I tell you this? Because from the time you're in the womb, and we know from pre-imperial natal research that you can be traumatized as a fetus, and you will take in the unspoken traumas and expectations of the mother. And then before you have language, you see, how do I organize the world? Well, how is my mother organizing the world? How is my father organizing the world? And there's a pattern that you are totally unconscious of and unaware of. And that's how you filter everything in your life. It's much deeper than a limiting belief, because you can bring a limiting belief into awareness like oh, I'm not enough. That can pop up for most people pretty quickly, but that's not the organizing principle that serves to function everything that gets interpreted, that enters into the unconscious mind. So as she became aware of this, I said, so what is your relationship to your husband having all of these lunches and dinners and just conversation with this other woman? And she said to me, I'm not enough. I said, that's a limiting belief, but how would your mother feel about this? And you could see she was internal and then contemplated, and then she said, my mother would assume that there was much more betrayal and everything, and my mother would suffer and have nothing but pain and nothing but pain and nothing but pain. I said, but isn't that the same thing? Every time you try and negotiate bringing the marriage back together, you go into, you did this, you betrayed me, and you go into pain, pain, pain. And she said, yeah, I do. And I said, so let's think about it this way. We can't change that he had these meetings with this woman. But instead of looking at, look what he's done to me, he's like every man. I mean, you have chapter and verse. You have everything your mother silently believes in. It's embedded in you. You had a pretty good marriage, but both of you, your life energy was like this. Something wasn't working for you in the marriage. She said, yeah, that is true. It wasn't bad. until he did this. I said, wait. What if I say to you that this is painful, what happened, but we have to keep our life energy flowing. And he planted a stick of dynamite that blew up the unrealistic image you had that the marriage was working. So perhaps both of you now have a gift. He didn't run away with another woman. He didn't have 5 affairs. He didn't spend all your money and give it to somebody else, etc., etc. And she said, it still hurts. I said, I didn't say it didn't hurt. But what about a different relationship to the same experience? And she was quiet and she said, I think my mother's deepest attitudes, I'm filtering everything through that. I said, yeah, and we know that trauma made those attitudes, ingrained them in your mother. But you're not your mother, you're yourself. And she said, yeah, we could have lived out our marriage without really having to find out who we were and what we could do for each other. I said, yeah, and now we can work on some of the traumas that you had in your family, and your husband has his traumas. But this organizing principle has served as an inner active guide that you had no awareness of. So you were making a lot of life choices without any choice. And this is one of the painful things about trauma. It sets up an inner structure that then filters everything, and you're not in charge of your own life. So I also wanted to point out to this particular case, and they're doing very well, and I think the marriage is going to get back together in a much better way. And that now they can really negotiate, because she's not negotiating from the unspoken traumatic assumptions her mother has made and that she's taken in. And he has some of his own from his own family. But the most important thing about trauma work, and here slow is best, it's taken me weeks, and I work pretty quickly, to finally hear this, that I wasn't anxious to try and clear up the trauma, but to have the client feel that no matter what they discovered or what they could tell me, they were safe in telling it to me. And even when she got very upset with me and felt I wasn't agreeing with her and I was taking her husband's side, and I could say to her, really? And she would stop. And she would say, I don't agree with you, but I know you really want me to resolve this in the way that's best for me, whether the marriage stays together or doesn't. And she would come back into doing the work with me. So the sense of engagement and connection in trauma, and I can teach you that, what lets that other person know your intention? And you probably have never been taught this, because actually trauma, and we only know about trauma. I started in the field of trauma 30 years ago when nobody knew anything about it but analysis, and analysis did not work. That feeling of safety and what's my intention? And I said to her at one point when she was very angry with me, because she didn't like what I was saying, and if you don't like what I'm saying, why wouldn't you be angry? I said, what's my intention? And she stopped. Now, she didn't answer intellectually. She had to answer from her experience with me, and her experience with me was that I had accepted whatever she was doing and struggling, and even when she got triggered and she was quite irrational, I accepted her the way she was. And this is really hard. I can teach her how to do that so that she could feel safe expressing who she was. And I'm very happy to tell you something that surprised me. She said, "You know what the deepest pain is?" And I thought, uh-oh, is she going to go into her mother's thing again? And she said, I said, "Let me listen, because I think she's going to tell me something she's never said and I haven't heard." She said, "Yeah, something in me says, oh, there's another woman. I'm not enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't right enough." She said, "But you know, my fear is that he was talking to this other woman and I can be replaced." Now, all I had to do was to sit back. I put my hand on my heart and I just reflected to her what she had just put words to. You have a sense that you can be replaced, and that brings up tremendous pain. And her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Yeah, but this comes from what I saw my father doing, and yet I had to bring money into the household to support his drinking. This comes from so many traumas where, yeah, you can say I wasn't valued, I wasn't enough, but notice, she shared her felt meaning of the traumatic experiences that were triggered by her husband having this other connection. I can be replaced. Now I can tell you, in all my studies and 55 years of practice, I've never had another client who said that to me, but when she said it, I knew two things. I knew that she was telling me the meaning for herself, and now we had the salve to heal the wounds. And I just looked at her and I said, you know, sometimes you're so bright and you work so hard in treatment, and sometimes you're so difficult, but you cannot be replaced. Not with me, anyway. You are uniquely you. You can never be replaced. And you could just see her whole body change. And then she said, maybe I hate what happened, but it's a good thing, because now perhaps we can rebuild the marriage. And if not, I'm going to be okay by myself. Now, what I share with you for me is deeply moving and dramatic, and it's working subtly with the epicenter of her deep unconscious belief systems that are controlling her life and her behavior, which started out with, I just want transparency. And I'm full of pain. And she would always go back when her husband said anything, you're justifying it, you're just causing me more pain. Now she began to separate out. Now, I could have worked on, her being beaten by her father, or seeing her mother being beaten by the father, or having to support the family while he was drinking because he couldn't make any money, but she didn't count as a person. We'll get to all of that. But the importance with trauma is your ability to travel with the client until they tell you we're at the center of the center. And then piece by piece by piece, you can clear out the trauma. Now, something else I think to both interest you and challenge you was the biggest challenge for me with trauma. I can teach you, and there are different ways to work with different people. You can heal physical trauma. There's all kinds of medicine and alternative medicine and so on. You can heal, and I have traveled the world learning from different people who learned how to heal one aspect of trauma. By the way, don't believe anybody says, if you use EMDR, it will heal all trauma. It won't. If you use this process, you use body work, it will heal. No. Trauma exists on so many levels, you have to use multi-dimensional systems, all of which I've been trained in, but you don't have to take all that training. I can give you the components you need. But when you've healed the physical, when you've healed the psychological, what I discovered is that trauma, when it accumulates, causes a spiritual wound. And this is a big challenge, because how do you rekindle a spiritual connection without imposing your religious or spiritual beliefs? And I've struggled with this for a long period of time. I can teach you how to do that because I learned. I went from one spiritual leader to another, asking them this question. They all gave me wonderful answers, but it was infused with their spiritual belief. And I don't want my belief to be my client's belief, because my client is a separate human being. They have a special connection to spirit that's different than mine. Until somebody said to me, very wise, you have to be authentically who you are and live your connection to spirit. And then, when the client says to you, what do you know that I don't know? Now you have a conversation. I learned this when I was working in Guatemala during the Civil War with the indigenous populations, and I won't tell you the horrific stories I heard. Or war is war, and believe me, you don't want to be there. And of course, it destroyed their spirituality. And I learned, because they started me on my journey, how do I rekindle something that's important? Because all healing is implicit, it's relational, and it's sacred. The deepest level, any therapist who's been really effective, no matter what they've practiced for years and years and years, and after 55 years, got a lot of practice, you know that the deepest level of healing is sacred. How do you evolve yourself, which is my challenge to you, but I can teach you and give you some of the parameters, and it's a process, so that you live authentically within your spiritual connections, and then people will ask you, what do you know that they don't know? I have healed so much of my trauma. You're not going to have me say to you, I've healed all my trauma, because even I know that's bullshit, because there are traumas happening to me right now. The difference is, in the pandemic, I'm not being traumatized because I've developed resilience. What's really important is not just to help the client and support them in the healing, but to build in resilience, because you know what? Trauma never stops happening. Just when you thought you knew what the world was about, the world stopped being the world you knew about. That's traumatic. It is not how far you fall, it is how high you bounce. It's resilience. So I can tell you that I think that it is our duty as healing professionals to build in a unique resilience in relationship to what that means for the client, So when they have future traumatic experiences, it doesn't traumatize them. So I have not been traumatized. Yes, I've had some bad dreams. Yes, I've had to say, oh my God, I'm used to teaching you in person. And when I said, because of the pandemic, I have to teach online. No, 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 no. Wait a minute, if I've survived the traumas in my life, and I've been teaching for all these years at major universities and institutes, I'm not creative enough to be able to teach this to you online? No. I'm not sure how, but I've lived my life saying yes to things and then learning how to do it. And I know how to teach, so how to have the resilience. And when you're not weighed down with trauma, when you're not weighed down with systems that are determining how you proceed that you don't know about because it hasn't come into your awareness, because it exists in your non-conscious mind, and that's the power of Erickson's work. We work with the non-conscious mind where 95% of change exists. Is now I have a resilience so that I'm going to bounce pretty high. And I have so much more to tell you about trauma, but what I can say, which I think is most important, is that I want you to be able for yourself to become the person you were meant to become. And trauma, when it gets stuck, when it becomes PTSD, makes that almost impossible. I live a life that I'm consciously aware of the unconscious influences that were making my decisions. And now with that awareness, I make very different decisions. So I can't say that I will never be traumatized, but what we do know, and this is very interesting, as you heal the trauma, the very methods that you use to heal, the way you build resistance, which I can teach you and have the methodology to teach you, makes it less likely that if you and I are in the same traumatic experience, I am less likely to be traumatized than you. You can build an inner psychological strength and emotional and physical awareness that means that in traumatic situations, you are less likely to shut down and become traumatized and stuck than the person that doesn't have this ability. So trauma work is also, it's not just about resilience, but it's a vaccine. Trauma will occur, but you will go from a 90% chance of being incapacitated to a 70% chance to a 50% chance. Now, of course, there's going to be some kind of trauma that you may get stuck. But most traumatic experiences that occur in my life cause me to stop and pause and think. But my system is able to process them, and I don't get traumatized in the same way. So I've mentioned a lot about trauma, and one of the things I can tell you is that when you work with trauma, you're in a very negative field. And you have to learn how to be really relationally available with trauma without suffering from secondary trauma. Because if you don't know how to protect yourself, and it doesn't mean putting a wall up, because that means that your client won't have you available to them, and so your work isn't going to work. But I've worked in very traumatic experiences with populations where the other therapist didn't have those tools, and they became physically or psychologically ill. So it's very important, if you want to work with trauma, that I be able to teach you how not to have secondary trauma. You can't stay in a negative field without being traumatized if you don't have the tools not to be traumatized by the negativity that's surrounding you. And I want to close, at least at this moment, that humor and joy and pleasure and happiness and just being able to laugh at yourself is also part of trauma treatment. And being able to enter into that, because you have two things that you want to do with trauma that are so important, is to raise the vibrational connection. Because my client is, I'm a woman, I'm going to suffer and pain and so on. That vibration will only attract pain. To be able to teach your client how to move out of that vibration to a more positive vibration, because then you're going to attract more positive vibrations in your life. And the other thing is, you can have tremendous trauma that doesn't preclude happiness and joy. And when your life energy begins to flow again, happiness and joy is automatic. And you can, and I can teach you, how do you maintain that within yourself, and how do you introduce it in a respectful way so that your client can notice the energetic nourishment that they get from being able to laugh at themselves, or to enjoy a beautiful sunrise or sunset, or even the freedom of knowing that they are making choices and their life isn't being predetermined by their traumatic experiences or their core organizing principles that have never come into awareness. So it's counterintuitive. It's a wonderful challenge. I can teach you ways of protecting yourself so you don't become traumatized, and guide you through bringing your trauma into awareness so it does not interfere with the profound effectiveness you can have with your clients as they process trauma, become more resilient, and open to the life that they deserve.